Welcome everyone. Bonjour. And welcome to everyone attending here. We are reporting our webinar from the Owen McKiernan Library. My name is Natalie Nugent-O'Shea. I'm Celtic Junction's Executive Director. We are deeply honored to present to you our social justice series. We founded these social justice seminars with the goal to give a platform to marginalized voices as we educate and connect our audiences. This year's events are focused on BIPOC, First Nations, and LGBTQIA artists and speakers. And of course, today, as you know, our seminar is the power of Indigenous languages. We feel it's important to start by the very beginning in gratitude. This program is sponsored in part by the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Immigrant Support Program from Ireland, and of course, Ireland's Consul General to the Midwest. Before we start, it's my pleasure to have this opportunity to thank them and to welcome our Vice Consul General to introduce our program today. Here is Sarah Keating.
Díomh Gachtainna, Tá Anna áthas orm bheith an seo living. I'm delighted to join you here today to introduce this event, the power of Indigenous languages. Is Mrs. Sarah Keating, agus Tom in my last consul, ag an Ord Consulate na Héireann in Chicago. I'm the Vice Consul at the Consulate General of Ireland in Chicago. I've been in this post for 3 years now, and during my time here, I'm frequently struck by the wide range of interest there is in Gaeilge and its teaching across the Midwest. The Celtic Junction Arts Centre has created a wonderful home for the language in Minnesota, and the work they do, including events like today, in allowing the language to grow and thrive here is really fantastic. Indigenous languages are a powerful tool that allow us to celebrate and explore our identity and our history. Nar osmi suas ag leabhart an Gaeilge seachas ar scoil. I didn't grow up speaking Irish outside of learning it in school, like all children in Ireland. Ach bhíod speisialta imo crí ó bhíos óg don teanga. The language has always had a special place in my heart. Níl mo cuid Gaeilge furfa in éoncur. My Irish is not perfect, but I enjoy using it as an important part of my heritage and cultural identity. It is always very humbling to see Irish being taught and spoken so far from home in places like Minnesota, and I think that really highlights the power that language has. Today's talk gives an important platform for discussion for not only the value and preservation of Gaeilge, but also of other Indigenous languages, such as the Anishinaabe language. There has long been connections between the Irish and Ojibwe people in this part of the world, and it is wonderful that these connections are being drawn on again today in relation to our Indigenous languages. Today's discussion will focus on the importance of learning from the experiences of others and their struggles as we consider how best to protect and preserve our native languages. I know that Margaret, Dáithí and Michael will have many thought-provoking insights on this topic, and I look forward to hearing them. Gurv Míle Maithe, thank you very much to Natalie O'Shea and all at Celtic Junction for inviting me to be a part of today's event. To Súlagum go buin sibh Tana Vos an Léach seo. I hope that you enjoy today's lecture. Slán agus Beannacht. Thank you and goodbye.
So to Sarah, to our panelists, and to everyone who is joining us here in a brief community as we start on this exciting journey, we want to make it a journey of wonder, discovery, and connection. So to begin, allow me to lay the groundwork. I suppose what we want to do first is find a center and a purpose. So where to begin? We'll start with purpose. In one beautiful native creation story, the first human was Sky Woman, who fell to the center of this place. Her life was saved by the animals and supported by Mother Earth. She was referred to in one of the books that I was reading as the first immigrant. She learned with patience and humility the names of all things and brought a gift of sweetgrass to share. So with our gratitude, we want to consider what is our gift today. I'd like to suggest perhaps with me, we make it our collective open hearts. We all have differing ways. Each one of us comes from a people who were once Indigenous somewhere. And another way, each of us is an immigrant in this world too. So with an open heart, perhaps we can receive this feast today. It's a feast of words, of stories, and of knowledge. Next, we'll go to the center. That's back to the journey. And I think the way I'd like to start is to begin with understanding who we are in our relationship to the world. So we can start by asking and sharing 3 questions. Who am I? Where do I come from? and what brought me here? Now, I know that can get complicated, especially the latter. Are you here to seek knowledge, identity, inspiration, connection? Now, while you all as audience ponder that question and that answer comes to you in whatever way it does, please include what you're willing to include in the chat. We would love to know with whom we are sitting today and to embrace your purpose along with ours. Meanwhile, I'll start with mine and I'll ask our panelists to share in a moment. The 3 questions. Who am I? Well, my name, Natalie, comes from my 2 aunts, Nancy Lee and Patty Lee, made Natalie. My father's name, Nugent, and my Dublin-raised husband, O'Shea. Where do I come from? I am an American born in St. Paul, Minnesota. I've traveled the world and come back here to my home. I am mostly 4th, 5th generation Irish, Finnegan, Foley, Noonan, Nugent, but with a healthy dose of Scandinavian, as with most Minnesotans, or many. What brought me here? My earliest loves have always been stories, language, art, and I think they're all tied together, particularly in mythology. I think mythology is one of the greatest gateways to language. I studied Italian, French, Hellenic, and Koine Greek, and have only come to Irish recently. I recognize for me, I have a real thirst for that archetypal energy. And yet somehow I've only come recently to understanding and reading native myth and language. It's speaking to me now, and my purpose here is to be ready to listen. So as you are all sharing, you're welcoming each other here with your own purpose. And we'll go to our panelists. So with delight, we await their responses. These are really special people we're so honored to welcome here. You've already read some of their incredible biographies, but now we get to welcome their voices, which will guide us on our journey. We'll start with our scholar of early and medieval Irish at University College Dublin, also teacher of Irish culture and history from the University of St. Thomas and the University of Minnesota, author and musician, Dáithí Sproule.
Hi, how are you doing? Great to be here. It's more an honor to serve a panel show Mike, August, Margaret, August and Natalie. It's a great honor to be asked to talk and have a conversation in the context of the Irish language, which, you know, I can honestly say I've loved all my whole life. But the questions that Natalie has asked, of course, are big questions. Who am I? What am I? Is the biggest question of all, of course. But to answer it just historically, I'm from a place called Derry, which is a small city in the northwest of Ireland. And as it happens, since we're talking about identity, of course, identity has is a huge issue if you're from the north of Ireland. But anyhow, Derry. Funny thing about the town I'm from is that. You know, as we were growing up, there was a lot of talk about nationalism and Ireland and freedom from British colonization and so on. It hasn't been a kind of distant or historical issue for us. It's been a matter of urgency, and it's all around us, you know. But funny enough, I had a funny thought when Natalie was introducing the topic, and that is that I think I speak for most of my brothers and sisters, as far as I know, but you know, where you're from is a very particular thing. You know, in other words, I'm from Derry. I'm not from Buncrana, which is 15 miles away. You know, like this particularity of where you're from is very important to Irish people. So the first thing, you know, like say I see some musician on YouTube or I hear about them coming, or a writer. The first thing I want to know is where are they from? You know, and I'm looking to see, and it might even say Indiana, for example. No, but where in Indiana? Anyhow, so that's something about now. But as far as this identity issue is concerned, being from Derry, my father's father, my grandfather, his name is Sproule, and my name is Sproule, and his lineage going back is actually Protestant people who originally were. You know, the first Sprouls in our line came over from Scotland as colonists and as settlers. And my great-grandfather would have been a Protestant. And my grandfather was in the Irish police, who at that time would have been the opponents of Irish freedom. And then my other grandfather, my Frank Carney, he was he got involved in the IRA and in the process of trying to free Ireland. So I literally am kind of adjoining to some extent of the both sides. And then of course the Irish language, always very important. I started learning songs in the Irish language as a child, just phonetically to sing in fishes. And the fish, which is a thing very familiar to people at the Celtic Junction and so on. The fish was a big thing every year, the competitions, and we were all involved with the music more, the singing. And then in my teens, I was sent to the Gaeltacht, the Irish language area in Donegal, to learn Irish. And then it became just organically part of my life because I was meeting my best friends there. And I was meeting girls there, and we were having dancing, and I was walking the countryside all the time, getting wet in Donegal, walking the hills. And so all that is tied up with the language for me and the music, which has, and you said, why am I here being, at this moment I'm in Wisconsin, but I live in Minnesota. It was a combination of, traditional music and playing traditional music and traveling with traditional music and love and relationship. Those are the reasons where I am, why I am where I am.
Thank you, Dáithí, so much for sharing. Next, we'll go to Margaret, professor of English and American Indian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, editor of Ojibwe.net, and poet. Margaret Noodin.
Kumagwacha, Natalie, bonjour, Jiadev to everyone. It's really such a treat to be here. Gaeilge and Anishinaabemowin. It's really, for me, a full circle connection that has, I think, spanned, as I'll explain here, many decades actually. Gaeilge Noodin de go, Ojibwe Margaret is Anamdom. Margaret was the name of both of my grandmothers. So my father's mother and my mother's mother were both named Margaret. So it was inevitable that I would be a Margaret. And from a very early age, I loved language. So when you ask, who am I? Words and language have just always been the center of everything to me. So ultimately, I am American, born in Minnesota, actually born in Greeley, Colorado, but then we moved when I was very young to Minnesota. So I mostly identify with the lakes and the land in Minnesota and have really spent a lifetime learning the languages that I could, which for many, many years was primarily French and Ojibwe. It is probably a bit embarrassing that I sit here with Dáithí Sproule, who was the person that inspired me to study Celtic literature, which I now teach at Milwaukee. But at the time, there were no Irish language classes. In the 80s, when I was in college, that was just really not an option. It was not a part of my ancestry that I really had access to in terms of language. I was very inspired by Scarborough, by other opportunities to hear the Irish language, but I did not have the ability to study it in a way that would make me fluent. However, Ojibwe, I could see that need was there. So, I worked with many people, and so like Grand Portage with Norm Deschamps there, I spent many times working on teaching and at Fond du Lac. So these are places that I've been connected to, which I think kind of explains where I come from. So originally born in Colorado, but grew up very much in Minnesota. In Chaska, a Dakota place, our state, Minnesota has a Dakota name, but I very early on sort of identified with the spaces up north. My father and my grandmother were singers and listened to every part of nature and could answer it. And it was always something that I felt as a real challenge. How can we speak the languages of our ancestors and learn to sing and sort of bridge those gaps in time that can move us between generations? I guess what brings me here now, if I were to say, I'm here as a teacher from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is a much more Ojibwe name, but here in this space, I also work to teach the basic introduction. I am not anywhere near as fluent in these languages as I am in Ojibwe, but continue to work and learning more of the Menominee, Oneida, Ho-Chunk, Potawatomi. These are the languages that my students at our institution take, and supporting their diverse Indigenous identity has really been a part of who I am, trying to let everyone learn their ancestors' languages. So that is why I'm here. I know I need to continue my my journey to learn even more Irish and continue to, I think, help all of the folks with languages less commonly taught know that they are so important and so valuable, and they are our connection across time, I think.
Thank you so very much, Margaret. And last but not least, we welcome our Native American Studies Faculty Director from the La Courte Ojibwe College, editor of the Rosetta Stone Ojibwe, author and musician, Michael Sullivan.
Oh, miigwech Natalie, miigwech Meg, Dáithí. Bonjour and dinaway maganadug. I greet you all as my relatives. I'm Migizi is my Ojibwe name. And Natalie asked me to share a little bit about that. So in our Anishinaabe custom, in our Ojibwe custom, we try to get our babies named as soon as we can when they're born. So when I was a baby, my mom followed that teaching, and she sought out an old man from Fond du Lac, one of the communities that Meg is connected to there in northern Minnesota. And my grandmother was really good friends with this old man, and his name was Joe Shabayash. And he's the one who came down to LCO and gave me my Anishinaabe name when I was a baby, and he gave me the name Migizi. And our namers, they seek out those names through the spiritual realm. We're a spiritually minded people, and I guess if we were to be studied by outsiders, which we've have been, there's a big tradition, a superstition among the Anishinaabe, or what gets interpreted as superstition, gets misanalyzed. We're spiritually thinking people, and we think that every single one of our paths, when our paths connect, it's no coincidence. It's all because we're guided by the hand of our Creator. And so that's a name that I'm known as in my Anishinaabe universe, is Migizi. And then my public school name is Michael Sullivan, Senior. And I got a junior, my boy Niju. But I'm from the Lakudere Ojibwe Reservation. Odawaza Gaeilge is its Ojibwe name. It's Ottawa Lake is what it means. And prior to the Ojibwe settling here at Lakudere, the Odawa are related. One of our sister tribes had previously occupied this area. And then prior to them, the Dakota people, our relatives a little more further south of where we are now, they occupied this area at one time too. So we always acknowledge that. But I'm from Lakudere. I've lived here my entire life. The only time I've ever lived anywhere else was through my graduate work, when I had to live in Minneapolis for a little while to do my master's degree and my PhD. I'm a trained linguist, so I study language in scientific detail. And as the bio stated, my mom's Anishinaabe. She's an Ojibwe woman from the reservation here, and my father is an Irish man, or Irish descent. But I was raised by my mother's side here at Lakudere and with her family. And my grandmother, my mom's mom, ended up marrying an Irishman, and it was in Chicago. So when we had our welcome address from Sarah there at the Irish Center in Chicago, that really kind of struck a chord with me, because that's part of my lineage. My grandmother was one of those Anishinaabe women who got on the bus during a period of time called relocation, and they were shipping Anishinaabe people off of the reservations into the cities to sort of integrate them in mainstream culture and assimilate them, give them jobs and apartments, and hope that they would pick up the Western ways of the colonizers. And it's through that, a lot of the Anishinaabe neighborhoods in Chicago and Minneapolis, and were often juxtaposed alongside the Irish neighborhoods. And, there were a lot of similarities between the people, and sort of humility between the people, that my grandma took a liking for an Irishman, and my grandfather took a liking for an Anishinaabe woman. So that's where all of us came from. And as a kind of spiritual thinking people, what am I doing here? Or what, to answer the third question, we have a belief that as Anishinaabe people, we're all put here for a reason. There's a sole purpose. There's something we're supposed to finish while we're here. And we don't get to leave here, this human existence, until we fulfill that purpose. And so the idea is that we live every day trying to figure out what that purpose is. And when we're on the right path in life, things go good for us. When we're going towards the path that leads to that purpose, things go good for us. When we get off of that path, whatever path it is, wherever it leads, whatever the Creator had intended for us, whenever we get off that path, things typically don't go very well for us. So what am I doing here? I really don't know, but I'm trying to stay on my path. My passion is language and music, and I've dedicated my life to that. I've been singing traditional Anishinaabe music since I was a little boy, and I was raised in the ceremonial drum hall here at Oreilles, where we have our seasonal dances 4 times a year. So I was raised around our traditional music and ended up falling into that role as a child to be a singer. And then later in life, as I acquired our language, our Anishinaabe-Mowin, is through that I started to kind of get pushed into the role of storyteller and keeping our traditional Waadookodaadong going. We have a traditional winter tradition of telling our sacred stories, our oral history that date all the way back to the beginning of time, the beginning of the human race. And those stories have been told from one generation to the next since the beginning of time. And so I've kind of been nudged into a role by some of our elders to continue that tradition going. So I guess that's what I'm doing here. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Mike. We could just talk about who you guys are and what you do this whole time, but I thought maybe we could just acknowledge, thank you so much to those audience members who are sharing their stories. I see people in the Scottish tradition, Welsh. There's actually some other native speaker making commentary there. I won't take too much time looking into the chat. What I want to do is really use our time wisely with these panelists and talk about the idea of the value. And even before that, I suppose, really, how do languages create our worldview? In my readings, what really struck me, if you look at, for example, just a small example, the Ojibwe tradition, it was so beautiful. In the story that was shared in the book, they mentioned Sky Woman who fell to earth. I said that earlier on, but when she came, she received the names of the plants and animals when they shared them with her. And that did take the patience and humility, and it took listening. And those names were given and sacred. And it's so interesting to look at then the kind of almost polar opposite in our English or Western tradition, or perhaps better to said the Judeo-Christian mythology. Adam and Eve are created by a father God. They're given the world. They name everything. They're given a different role. And then, of course, through sin, they're banished to roam the earth nearly as strangers. And I was thinking, you know, we become partly who we are with our words. And most of us are raised under English. We don't necessarily have the native speaking capacity, which is such a gift. We're not always raised within that, probably the majority of people listening to the seminar here. And how that worldview can really affect how we even approach the path and the journey on our lives. You know, if we're receiving names as opposed to making them, there's that human-centric role that the Judeo-Christian part plays, and then there's the other part that we're visiting here. We're here to take care of it and to honor the world. And with that, creating either responding to how do languages create our worldview, or what do you see the cost of the assimilation when we lose that native language and that worldview? If anybody would like to take over, that would be brilliant.
There's so many interesting things in what you have mentioned just there. You know, it's debatable, and it's actually debated. Does a language inherently have a worldview in the language, like in the structure of the language itself? It's really a difficult one, and I don't think we should demonize the English language. Obviously, the English language is a wonderful language, and it's our language, all of us here, as well as the other languages, you know. But I think the one thing I'm trying to hold on to one strand that I might be able to make a coherent point about, and that is that You see, the thing about the English language is that obviously it was the language of the invaders and colonizers in our territories. And colonization really is it lies at the root of almost every problem in our world, including, by the way, global warming, which comes from the capture of the land belonging to other people and then its exploitation. And that's what has resulted in global warming. But anyhow, the thing about, English versus, Irish language and Native American languages is, the English language has, it's such a huge thing, but it has been the language of the people whose civilization has really moved in a certain direction. And that direction has been in the direction of materialism, by which I mean looking at the world as made up of things, that the trees are things and the stones are things. And then through science, which is a wonderful thing, science is a fantastic thing because it's an effort to find the truth. But unfortunately, it has reduced everything to a thing, chemicals and substances and so on, to the extent that even we ourselves have been made into things, that are studied in laboratories and so on. Now, the thing that you will find in other cultures, like in the indigenous cultures, is a completely different attitude, which I think was originally shared by all our peoples, and which was that the world was alive and that it was full of spirit, that everything was full of spirit, and this spirit was the power of the other world. And that the other world, our relationship with the other world, with the unseen world, which actually makes everything happen, was vitally important. And we should speak and listen. And of course, the word listening also cropped up once or twice there. And I think that lies an awful lot at the root of, say the traditional music world, for example. The traditional music, Irish music, has really carried on a lot of the greatest things about our old culture. And to use that word respect again, the idea of respecting the elders and realizing we're just learning. And how are we supposed to learn anything? How do you learn anything? You listen. Listening is such an important orientation. You listen and you look around and you listen to what's being said and so on. So that's part of what your question made me think of. I mean, obviously our language, and I'm sure like the Native American languages as well, in our language, there's all this wonderful, riches of poetry and feeling and philosophy. Like I'm lucky enough to get to one of the things that I do that I enjoy most in the Centre for Irish Music is I teach myth classes. I'm teaching one at the moment. And what I love is, taking Old Irish or Middle Irish texts, translations of them, and showing how there is a philosophy in this. There is a coherent way of looking at the world here. It's not some little old-fashioned, silly old thing to do with fairies and so on. It's actually a coherent way of looking at the world. And it's a valuable one, and it's true. Anyhow, so that's my take on some of what you were pointing towards there, Natalie.
Mike or Margaret, would you guys like to respond or add to that?
We probably all have something that we could say, but if we're, kind of connecting thoughts here, listening to Mike talking about the importance of story, and then when you brought up what you did, Dáithí, I turned back to something I had translated a while ago. B'madisajik ga Gaeilge zewak jizagi gowat Gaegun ga Gaeilge wadun je abdichigadek nongum Gaegun onsam zagatawat gae b'madisajik abajigowat when je majishawebak, which was my attempt to put into Ojibwe what the 14th Dalai Lama said about people being created to be loved and things being created to be used. And our problem today is that we are reversing those. We are creating things to love and people to use, and that's where we get bad happenings. So I have no idea what language he would have said that in. I suppose that's an area for another linguist. But I think that's what we lose when we don't take time to listen to one another. We lose all our stories. I think in Irish the word is a seanachal, and in Ojibwe I've heard some elders use Gaeilge, a little proverb, something between maybe or related to Bookshop and Anishinaabe. And that's what I think we lose. When we lose our languages, we lose the stories that are connected to them and our ways of understanding who we are in this place. I'm sure Mike might have something to add.
Yeah, I think when you speak Ojibwe, and I speak English as my first language, Ojibwe as my second language, and then I picked up a little Dakota Iape when I was in graduate school. I had to take another language, so I got to study some Dakota language a little bit too. But my perspective, when we speak Ojibwe, it's a humble perspective, and it's exactly opposite from when we speak English. And you couldn't have a better case in point, a better example than the Ojibwe language. Because if you learn Ojibwe, you learn from people older and wiser than you. That's your only option. And through that experience, you get to hear about our history and our stories, and it's all, if you have a good holistic run at picking up Ojibwe. And when we listen to our stories, listen, and we hear about our creation and our belief system, we were put here dead last. I can't attest to the creation story I've shared earlier, but in our local prescribed creation as Anishinaabe people, it was the four-leggeds who were put here first, all the animals. And then the second ones put here were the ones with the wings that fly in the sky, all the birds. The third ones put here were the ones in the water. And the last ones put here on this earth were the two-leggeds. And what our elders teach us is that the world would be just fine without us. In fact, the world would probably be better off without us. But we rely on everything that was put here first. So when you have that kind of perspective and you speak a language framed in that kind of perspective, we're meaningless. We're not here to dominate the world and cultivate everything. We're meaningless, pitiful, humble people. And when our great, great speakers speak Ojibwe, and we can really tease that out in the sort of levels of proficiency, if you will, when our great ones use language, they're great because they know how to sound pitiful. They're great because they know how to code their words and use particular features of the language that kind of reduce their own self-status. And that's quality Ojibwe, when you can talk like that. And it's counter opposite of being a hyper fluent speaker of a majority language, like somebody when speaks English, right? They're at the table and they're the expert and they're the one that's proficient. And they're the one that everybody listens to and respects. Well, it's in our culture, it's reverse. Your wise ones are those ones that listen, the ones that are watching the one with their mouth going all the way, and then they'll offer you something that means something. So it's different perspective. And if you have an opportunity to learn an Indigenous language like that, it'll humble you. It'll keep you in your place, and it'll remind you, we're nothing without creation. We're nothing without everything put here before us. That's my take.
Thank you so much, Mike. What you say, collectively really strikes me so much. And to start with what Dáithí had replied, it's not my intention, obviously, to demonize English, but to try and help what is probably mostly English speakers listening to this understand how I-oriented, self-oriented, human-oriented our languages, and maybe, the worldview that we have carried on our tongue, and the worldview that we carry with being part of the colonialization process is really a huge identity from the human perspective. I thought it was really beautiful, again, in Braiding Sweetgrass, a book that's really been stunning me as I read it. The plants, for example, the name to describe them that she says means those who give. The name is deeper. Even in Irish, if you you consider, what name is on you, or where is living on you, or what is emotion is on you, it feels different. It feels like it reveals a temporary state, and it implies a deeper one, rather than the I am, I feel. And that's part of where our challenge comes. So with challenges to Indigenous language, we've established most of it has been based in colonialization, which causes these other things. So we could have a whole seminar in each one of these topics, is the dispersion of the people speaking that language, which literally is just referred to in Ireland, or for us, as the diaspora. I'm here to serve that diaspora of Ireland. So they've been spread out, and that happened very obviously, not just in Ireland, but hugely in different ways in the native cultures across America. The other thing, of course, restricting access to that native language, sometimes making them illegal. Can't speak it, you can't broadcast it, you can't publish it. That went into the 60s, and dare I say, maybe even the 70s, it was still being challenged in Ireland, I know, with the kind of fighting for civil rights in the Gaeltacht. A loss of youth, of course, whether we talk about Ireland's mother baby homes, the Indian boarding schools, really those are kind of those soft titles that cover over that far deeper cruelty and hurt that those institutions caused. And of course, the loss of elders and native speakers we're facing right now, especially with the pandemic. We've lost some of our native speakers in Ireland, and I know it's hit native communities disproportionately. If you guys want to talk about the other challenges or the difficulty of those challenges that you're seeing your Indigenous languages face, let's start there, because I think some people aren't even aware of why or how these things happen. Let's put a name on it so that we can face it full on. Will anybody respond to that one? Did I name too many things? I might have. Or pick one and give a personal experience of it. And maybe Dáithí, you could start with being in the north of Ireland, being in Derry, having to seek the language, your experience going to find that.
Well, it's, my personal journey with the language tells, it enables me to make a couple of points. One was that, we were speaking English at home, but my grandmother, in fact, was an Irish teacher, although she had died before I was born. So we'd involved with the fish and those songs. And then I was studying Irish in school. You see, it's not, in other words, I was in the north of Ireland under British rule, and our school, St. Colum's College, which was a brilliant, though brutal school, I learned the Irish language under British rule, as it were, and we did exams, as part of the British educational system in Irish at a very high level. And I was going to the Gaeltacht, these regions that are, established governmentally, in a sense. The places are designated as Gaeltacht, but these are places, the final places where they're native speakers, people who are born and raised in the language, and to try and nurture that. So they play a huge role, but they're gradually losing numbers of speakers, but they're there, and then people are learning in the non-Gaeltacht areas. So a great thing that it's really so complicated. In the Republic of Ireland, the Irish language, as soon as Ireland got some measure of freedom, the Irish government wanted to revive the language. But in doing that, they made Irish compulsory in schools. So there you have force applied. And then people couldn't get civil service jobs unless they had a certain proficiency in Irish. So all that was making people feel negative about Irish. So there's a problem. There's so many problems. Now in my 20s then, I taught for a brief period in a school right in the centre of Dublin, that was a poor, probably rough area, is what you would call it. And the students I had hated Irish. And they looked down on Irish language as, belonging to country cultures, as country people. They looked down on it, and the school books that we had, you see, were so boring that these poor children, there's no way they could be interested in these books. If the books had told stories from mythology about warriors and all this stuff and people cutting off people's heads, they would have been more interested. But they were silly books. So then after that, there for 4 years, I was involved in Irish language publishing. So I was working for a publisher called Folan's that was producing books, for the schools in the Irish language, and was getting grants to do this here. So then I saw things from that point of view, and the business of standardization of language. This is a huge problem in Ireland. We have dialects that are all very different from each other. And therefore, we needed somebody to set up a standard dialect, because all the educational books, all the official government things had to be in the one form. We can't have all these different forms of the language, particularly from the point of view of editors and so on. So then you have another, kind of practical problem. And while I was doing that, then I always played music and I always sang. So I started, I was gradually performing. And of course, I love I can't even remember what question I'm supposed to be answering. But anyhow, I loved the songs and I loved the language and the poetry of the language. I just found it beautiful. I loved the Beatles as well, but I found the music beautiful. I was pursuing it because my friends were playing and speaking Irish, and I just thought this was beautiful. And I remember saying, so it wasn't for an ideological reason at all. And I remember when I went to college, and there were lots of people involved in the revival of the language. And a lot of them weren't really musical people, to be blunt. They weren't involved with music. And I remember thinking, people should employ the music more. The music is a path to reviving the language. So I'll stop there, but say one of the bands I've played with is Alton. I still play with them for the last 30 to 34 years or something. And they're from Donegal in the northwest of Ireland, a very particular part of Ireland with a very particular dialect and very particular music. They dedicated themselves, the leaders of that group, Mairead and Frankie, to the music, the language in a traditional way, and the music of that particular region, which wasn't terribly well known outside. They focused on it. And so there are people all over the world now who've heard of Donegal, the county of Donegal, and it's the neighboring county to me. So I spent half my life in Donegal. And through the power of music, people know about Donegal, this landscape that I love so much, that's behind me here in the hotel room, and they know about their language. So that tells you a lot about what I have been up to anyhow.
You did answer the question, Dáithí, and it really is what practices work to overcome the challenges that the languages are facing, and to go to the arts, whether it's music or poetry or mythology, is what really draws me. That's my personal story for sure. But what's really interesting, I'll point this out, and then Mike or Margaret, you can reply too, is that we have a panelist of artists here. We have poets, and we have authors, and we have musicians, and we have people that are both or all of them, that approaching language through that cultural arts is so stunning. If you guys want to take it from there, I'd love to hear from Mike and Margaret on how does your art help you overcome the challenges of the language?
Again, Tom Vigasi. I answered the last one. I can add after, but
oh no, please, Margaret, go ahead. We're not on a real hard timeline.
That's
I think
okay. I want to hear his answer. Yeah. I'll add to it.
Okay. Yeah. So I think for us in our community and the communities up this way, it seems like the musical thing is a rather safe aspect of our culture. When we think about culture and all the things within it, right? And culture is everything, and culture is hard to define. But if we think about traditional culture, local culture, our music is thriving. We have a lot of great singers that come from our communities and that are taught in the traditional fashion, and music is, you know, popular. We have powwows and round dances and things like that throughout the year that keeps our youth into the music. So that's one of the flashy things, right? That draw people in. Language is another beast, and they are related for sure. And I found all kinds of parallels to those who are successful with music tend to pick up language rather easy, and then, you know, language learners who pick up language fairly easy, vice versa, right? They're oftentimes have musical gifts as well. So there's definite parallels there. I think some of the problems we have in our community and LCO, where the reservation I'm from, we're rather fortunate. We have, you know, over 100 children who speak our language here through our immersion school, and there's, you know, 30 others like myself who are adult parent generation who speak Ojibwe to a high degree of proficiency. And so when you think about numbers alone, we're better off here than a lot of places. But still, you know, there's about over 7,000 enrolled members of our band of Ojibwe here at Oreilles, and less than 200 of us speak our traditional Ojibwe language. So it's extremely endangered aspect of our culture is the language. And how you motivate or how you convince everybody, right, from the top down, tribal government, elected officials, school administrators, teachers, even other parents, people on the street, why bother with Ojibwe, right? And same with your experience going through customs and somebody question your interest in studying Irish. It's people can't see beyond economics. People can't see, they think school and education and anything that you dedicate your studies to or your life to is based around and motivated by the almighty dollar, right, in this capitalist society. So what would you ever do with that? Or what are those kids ever going to do with that? That's the attitude that we face from our own people, And most of our educated non-natives in our area, the educated ones, they really value what we're doing, and they really see the beauty and the importance in what we're doing. The non-natives, it's oftentimes our own people we have the hardest time convincing. And you know, and that affects everything we do when we're in these different spaces and institutions funded by X, Y, and Z. You know, you have to convince the people that provide your funding that what you're doing is worth it. And that's probably the saddest thing about our effort here is we have to spend so much time validating our space we occupy and what we do to our own people, you know. And that's the thing that really I find to be the biggest challenge, having to convince your own people what you're doing. And for us, you know, back to the whole spiritually minded people that we are, if you're not that way, if you haven't had the opportunity or somehow were cheated out of our traditional way of life, our traditional spiritual way of life, then you don't even have that sentimental connection to the language, right? If you're from a assimilated family, if you're from a family who never really followed our way post-colonization, then it's just another old language that your grandparents used to speak. You know, nobody even really has that attachment to it if you're outside of those traditional sort of circles. So that's a battle, you know, that's a nonstop battle. And folks like myself, we gave up on, you know, trying to convince everybody and their mom to get on board. You know, we got tunnel vision and we got a goal to accomplish, and there's a prize at the end of the tunnel. And the more direction and energy we focus over here, then the less energy we can put on what we're trying to do. So one of my mentors, one of my colleagues, Waadookodaadong, she talks about this revitalization movement as being, we're trying to get more and more people into the canoe, right? He uses this analogy of a canoe, and we're flying down the river and we're bringing in more people, and the canoe's got holes in it all over, and we got people bailing water, but we keep bringing more people in. Meanwhile, everybody's on the shore shooting arrows at us. And we don't even have time to dodge or block the arrows because we're too busy shooting the rapids and keeping everybody in the boat. So that's kind of the feeling of what it feels like to be in the trenches here in our community is you're dodging arrows and you're paddling and you're bailing water at the same time, trying to make sure nobody falls out while simultaneously bringing more people on board. So if that can capture any of the chaos that you can imagine of what goes on in Indigenous language revitalization in a minority community, that's it to a T. So, Gaeltacht, Margaret.
Very much. I would totally agree. I think that chaos, that sense of trying so hard to get it right when there are 10 ways to be right. We have a lot of people who are afraid of getting things wrong, and we have a range of dialects that people might hear. And it always is, for me, really sad when people start learning something and then someone comes along and tells them, you've got that wrong, but it's just because their dialect was different. So sometimes helping people be resilient enough to keep going, because I have seen many, many elders across our 142 nations in the Great Lakes that have this language as its ancestral language. And most of those elders will understand each other, even if they're from, very distant points across the Great Lakes, because there's a core similarity. I've seen, even the way people who are speaking Ojibwe will understand people speaking Potawatomi or Menominee or Cree, these related languages. So I think giving learners the resilience to get through some of what is very confusing at the beginning, and like you say, maybe dodge those arrows and keep bailing, that is part of the challenge. You have kids, certainly here in Milwaukee, we have kids with an opportunity to learn, and yet we know they go home to a household where they might be the only speaker, and that's a big responsibility to put on somebody that's a 4 or 5 year old starting this language journey, and they go home and then they're the teacher right there. So finding ways to, I guess that's where we turn back to songs and stories and things that we can put out there for families to share together, just anything that we can do, because really making space for the language in daily life in our contemporary world is what is, so important. I like that image of the Jimon, the big canoe. May it keep going.
Dáithí, go on.
About this is all very negative, but I've got to point. I don't think I pointed at the successes, what I think are the great successes in Ireland, and one is the Gaeltacht radio, the radio station at the beginning of the 70s, about 73ish or so. They started in Ireland. The Gaeltacht started a civil rights movement for the language, to have road signs in our native language and so on, and out of that came the idea of setting up a radio station for all the Irish language areas. So it's one station, but you have this radio in the Gaeltacht, and it is wonderful and still there. I was listening to it on my phone on the way, from Minneapolis down to here. And what it is, they have a station in 3 of the main regions, each of the regions in the language, and they have lots and lots of music, and the links are in Irish, but then they have chat in Irish, and then the different regions could hear each other's language, and it really, the thing is, at the center of Irish culture, really, when all is said and done, is the company of other people, is chat, is conversation with other people. That's really what pubs are about. They're not about drinking, they're about meeting other people, and that's the highest form of entertainment to Irish people. So the radio in the Gaeltacht is a great success, and then they had an Irish language radio station too. And even before that, they had a club in Harcourt Street. The Gaelic League started up a club where you have to speak Irish. That's the only rule, but it's like a pub, and you have musicians and you have drink, but you have to have Irish. And so again, you have that thing of the company. So that's sort of going to the strengths, and such a simple thing, but I think that increased things like that have increased the respect for the language. A lot of English speakers look at the Irish language television station because it has great programs, and maybe there's subtitles in English and so on. Anyhow, so we have had some successes,
Well, it'd be fun to look at some of the other successes. I wanted to mention to our audience that the reference to the border guard that Mike Sullivan had mentioned was actually my experience. I was just recently 4 weeks ago in Ireland to be with my husband in his home and with his family. And as I went through the passport officer, he says, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I run an Irish Cultural Center." It's like, "In America?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Okay, well, what things do you do there?" And I said, "Well, we, present Irish music, dance." I said, "I'm even studying the Irish language." And he looked at me with a furrowed brow and sounded like the Billy Goat's Gruff, the largest of them, and said, "That is a primitive language and it has no place in the modern world. What are you doing that for?" And I was absolutely stunned to silence. So that's, I think, some of the internal attitude that Mike and Dáithí and Margaret are all facing. And that's one of the arrows, the slings and arrows kind of coming at the language. So finding where the joy is, finding where the connection is and how each person connects to it differently. And it's going to be in different ways, how they connect to it. To celebrate that is one of the things, obviously, that we want to encourage. And the other thing we'd like to encourage, of course, is any questions. So Q&A, audience, you guys have a button there. You can put in a question. And I have a first one here from Barbara. And if I may just kind of say this out, and then any one of you guys can field this if you wish. She asks, do you find that the places, lands we live in respond differently to Indigenous languages than to English?
Well, I think so, but I sing to chickadees and fish, so and write poems for frogs. So I think that it's a relationship. So when I think of place, we have a relationship with a place and all of the animacy in life that is there. And when we are able to understand that place in more than one way, to Dáithí's point, there are things about the mosaic of English that are powerful and useful. But in some ways, I know that as I've learned Ojibwe, I've really learned a lot about this specific place, the Great Lakes. There are things that if I go to Singapore, I think, I don't know how I would say that. I don't have words for that easily. I can describe it maybe in the language, but there are things unique to this place, and Ojibwe does a beautiful job of describing those. So I guess that's my thoughts on that.
I have another question here from Elizabeth. Could the panelists discuss how language influences individual and or cultural concepts of time and vice versa?
I think I'll answer for Ojibwe. We've, since the boarding school period of late 19th century, we kind of forcefully adopted the Gregorian calendar that everybody uses, right? The 12-month cycle. And prior to that, we had measured time based on a 13-moon cycle. In Ojibwe, it's based on the moons, right? As all the lunar sort of calendars are. So we had a 13-moon cycle originally that kept track of time. And we count our years by winters. So when we say how old we are, it's how many winters we've survived. And that's a pretty significant concept, because can you imagine living in northern Wisconsin, northern Minnesota, northern Ontario, for crying out loud, in a wigwam, 20 below. So we had to be tough, man. And to come out of there in the springtime was a feat. It was definitely an accomplishment. I'd say one of the striking features that differ between Anishinaabe Ojibwe culture and mainstream sort of colonial culture is it's a treasured accomplishment to be an elder. To acquire old age is an outstanding feat in Ojibwe culture, and our elders are celebrated for that. It's no we don't have any lack of example cases of our people dying young. And even in my own family, I had two uncles as a child, and both of them passed away young. And when I turned 40 years old, it was kind of like a reflection time to think about, if I got 40 more years left, what's it going to look like? And then I started to think about a lot of the males in my communities and don't really live beyond 60s or 70s if they're lucky. And just so our life expectancy as a people isn't as high as the norm. And that's huge. And that says a lot about why our elders are honored in the way that they are. And I had one of my uncles, one of my great uncles, my grandma's brother. I was really, really close with him, and he was one of my main teachers speaking Ojibwe when I first got serious. And he told me, he said, "You'll never know how hard it is to be old until you're old." And I got to see him talk for feasts and stuff, ceremonies for our relatives. And he would always say in the ceremonies that to be an elder means you've lost more people than you have left. And that really put it into perspective for me, because if you think about it, he was 85 years old when he left us, and he had lost way more people than he had left. He still had his wife left, but he had outlived just about everybody he was related to. And then I understood, what he was talking about, or at least understood as much as I could, being a young person. But that's a real significant difference in time, between what the Western world and Anishinaabe universe. We feel we're only here for a brief moment in the rushing river of time and the Creator's eye, right? We're just one drop of water in that rushing. Even a full 85-year lifespan is just one drop of water in the rushing river of time. So we're reminded to make the most of our time, because we're only here for a minute. So when we get to put our moccasins on this earth one time, and we're supposed to accomplish what we can and find that purpose why we're here. We're not here very long. We're not here for long enough. So we have to be productive in the use of our time, which is easier for some than it is for others. Right? But I think that's pretty significant, worth noting.
Well, Michael, thank you so much. One question here, and then there's another one. I think that's what we'll have time for, these two questions that we've already got. But if anybody has other questions, please put them in the chat, and perhaps our panelists will be kind enough to answer them post-webinar. Our next one is specifically to Margaret. Would you be willing to speak about the beautiful painting behind you?
Sure, yeah. So let me see if I can, this is the beauty of Zoom land, right? So if you can see it, this is a painting by Dave Shinanaquit, someone who we lost recently. And you can see that this is a woman who rises up much larger than the forest. That is really part of the sky, and the water is flowing through her hands. And he painted this for me when I was working on a republication of a novel by Simon Pokagon, Queen of the Woods. And I asked him, I said, with all of your knowledge of our culture and traditions in this area, how do you imagine the Queen of the Woods? Because the earlier images that book had been published with were fairly stereotypical. It was a book written at the end of the 1800s, and people at that time thought that these cultures were going to disappear. They were backward. They were, very, I would say, misunderstood at the time. So that is Dave Shinanaquit's imagination of what the Queen of the Woods would look like. And now, if you want a real bonus, since you're all over here at my house for a moment, this is there's the King of the Woods, because of course I live with an amazing Potawatomi speaker who is related to Simon Pokagon, and we had to ask, if we have the Queen of the Woods, what would the King of the Woods look like? So it's just, images that go with our stories, I guess.
Well, to get a chance to see them is such a treat. So our last question is from Brian Hart, and he's asking, given that they are native English speakers, how do you maintain your language skills and cultural practices when you live in English-speaking communities? That's a fantastic question. Thank you, Brian.
I could chime in for this one.
Thank you.
I do a lot of language coaching, right? There's a lot of people in Ojibwe country who are picking up Ojibwe through classes, language tables, stuff like that. And I've had the privilege of being a coach, being able to coach some of our language immersion teachers. And I'm a sole believer in you have to have access to the speech community, whatever that means, right? And for a lot of our communities in Ojibwe country, that speech community maybe is a couple elders at the elder center during meal times. For some of our reservations, that's it, or maybe it's an old couple who speaks Ojibwe and they're married and you got to go to their house to hear the language. And increasingly, more and more, we're starting to see immersion efforts starting to pop up, whether it's adult immersion training or you know, through schools and preschools and such. So it's always those folks who grow the fastest, and it's always those folks who maintain their skills the most. If you don't use it, you start to lose it, and that happens faster for some people than it does for others, and depending on your own language socialization and what your experience was. But it's like a muscle. I tell my students it's like a muscle. So if you don't work that muscle out, guess what? That muscle isn't as strong as it used to be. So you have to work it out. And the only way by doing that is using the language and being around other folks that use it. And myself, you know, I work at the community college now, our tribal college, where I teach adults, which is a transition for me. I'd been working with our youth for a number of years, and with the adults, you know, I convinced them, or I hope I convinced them, that everything I teach in class are the tools that are going to get you there, right? Nobody's going to learn how to speak Ojibwe by going to classes. You can get the roadmap, you can get practice, and if you got a good teacher, you may be able to get conversational, but you'll never be considered a proficient speaker just by going to class. It's what you do outside of class. It's where you put those resources and those skills to work, and you challenge yourself by being around others, hopefully more proficient than you. That's how you gain knowledge. And we never stop learning. You know, to think that there ever comes a day when we know the language is really naive. I mean, even in English, right? Every time we get to hear a really proficient, high-level English professor, if you will, or somebody speak during a lecture, wow, we get to hear how you're supposed to pronounce that word you've only read before prior to hearing somebody say it. I know that was my experience in linguistics. I was constantly learning English words, and whenever I get around, you know, those professors, it still, you know, challenges me. So same way with Ojibwe, there'll come a day when you have the pieces put together and things make sense when you talk, but you're always going to want a better word. You're always going to want a more descriptive term or a more sophisticated way to say it. So we never stop learning. I don't think, even if we're monolingual and we only speak one language, as fast as technology and the culture moves, we're constantly adding vocabulary to our repertoire. So that's my take on it.
Well, with that, we're actually going to wrap up the questions. We have a resource page for everyone. It's resources from each one of our guides today, each one of our teachers today. And we're so very honored to be able to share them. And one of the goals coming out of this, Margaret and Mike and Dáithí and I all worked together last year on a piece called Anam Carta. And that's the Soul Friends, that we are going to try to come back, not only what's coming up in an Irish language weekend during our Irish Arts Week this coming spring during April. We have that Anam Carta Revisited, so we'll actually hopefully be bringing Mike and Dáithí together again live here at the Celtic Junction. We have some Irish presentations and events, a seminar with our Sister Cultural Centre, Anna Chwaka from Armagh, Ireland. We are going to be welcoming the author, Monica Magan, the author of Aran Agus Im, for a theatrical presentation where you actually get to break bread and make butter with him. And it's our hope that what we can do is take some of these concepts and some of these ideas, some of the inspirations, and actually have an ongoing series of seminars. This was really just hopefully the first exploratory one. I think we could have so many more. And that everything here at the Celtic Junction has really been an organic process. And it's been one of the greatest pleasures of my life. And to be able to do this good work, I'm deeply grateful for. I'm grateful for Dáithí and Mike and Margaret today, and I know all of you are. So take a look at those resources. We have one present for you as you go, and that will be a little bit of a playback from our Anam Carta piece of Dáithí and Mike performing. And it's perfect for this time of year. So stick around and listen to that, and hopefully we'll see you again at some of our future webinars. Margaret, Mike, Dáithí, thank you so much.
second Gaeilge now and Waadookodaadong hen Margaret now and Waadookodaadong Gaeilge agus finne agus gave na mra now and Waadookodaadong and stu avan bahura spavil shebla now and Waadookodaadong mo Valentine nan will she da queen Maratham da vie second Gaeilge is the Hannick men dogra is the Hannick me gille agus finne agus gave na is the Hannick me and stu avan bahura spavel shebla is the Hannick me da Valentine agus níl she da clí mar athair
hey.